second chair back. She's not looking. Anna, wave. That's right. Jens. Our timer who will give points is right there. Okay. Our time management person is right here, just in case you get a wave.
Well, it's too much glare to pay attention to the time.
Well, I'll keep you close. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the American Enterprise Institute, and welcome to the current installment of our Education Policy Debate Series. I'm Nat Malkus. I'm a senior fellow and the Deputy Director of Education Policy Studies here at AEI, and it's good to see friends and some new faces here for our debate tonight. The COVID-19 pandemic was undeniably the greatest shock to public education in memory. From the outset, the federal government sent emergency funds to schools and school districts to support them. By almost any standard, the Fed sent a lot of money. In March 2020, President Trump signed the CARES Act, and $13.2 billion went to schools in the first tranche of elementary and secondary school emergency relief, or ESSER, funds. That's within 2 weeks of sort of the onset of the pandemic. Just that December, an added $54.3 billion went out in ESSER 2 funds. That's the second tranche with this CRSA Act. And 74 days after that, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan, which included $122 billion in ESSER 3. All told, $190 billion in ESSER funding. This is an unprecedented federal expenditure of money on schools. It was intended to fill immediate educational and instructional and non-instructional needs for schools early in the pandemic. It was intended to reopen schools, to do that safely, and to assist in the reopening of schools, and it was intended to ameliorate pandemic fallout and learning loss. Districts had wide latitude with what they could use ESSER funding for. There were few restrictions, but one restriction that is still in place is coming up this September, and that is when all the ESSER funding needs to be obligated and spent in relatively short order after that. Now, despite this, pandemic fallout is not over. We have not recovered educationally, either on test scores or on other measures. Students and schools are still struggling, and that raises a question, is there need for more federal stimulus for education, for more recovery funds? Now, advocates for additional funding from the feds argue that it could be more targeted, it could be more effective, and that productive programs, including high dosage tutoring, that's one of the favorites, they argue that the costs of giving more funding for these things are certainly lower than the costs of not spending on these. That prudent but substantial investments could do a lot to reverse learning loss. Opponents will point to $190 billion that was spent and wonder, where did it actually go? And did it go to any advantage for students and schools? Was it effective in combating learning loss and related woes? And would huge additional investments in federal spending, they argue these are unlikely to show a better return. That sounds like a debate, and tonight we're going to have it on the motion, $190 billion wasn't enough. The federal government should spend more on pandemic learning loss. All right, so I'll give you a little bit of our run of show. It's fairly simple. We have four excellent debaters who I will introduce in a moment. I'm going to ask them to start out with opening statements of exactly 3 minutes each, or limited to 3 minutes each. Following that, we'll have 20 minutes of Q&A that I'll direct. Then I'll turn it over to our audience, both here in person and online. I will be checking on my phone for questions. And following the audience Q&A, we'll have 2-minute closing statements and then a vote to see who wins. Now, our debate today is not decided by me, it's decided on you. In a moment, I'm going to open up the voting for the motion, and I'm going to ask you to vote on your phones. And then at the end of the debate, we'll vote again, and whoever moves the most of our audience's opinion will win the debate. On the debate, you can use the hashtag online, on X or Twitter, whatever you call it, hashtag AEI debate, and you can also tweet at AEI education. I would want to ask the audience to silence your cell phones, but don't put them away, because right now you're going to need them to vote. So if you will look on the screen, you can text the number on the screen to vote for the motion. $190 billion was not enough. The federal government should spend billions more on pandemic learning loss. You can text to 571-622-3318. If you support the motion, you text 1 to vote with the motion. If you oppose the motion, give us a 2 to that text. And if you're undecided, fear not, just enter 3, and we can record your votes. We're going to, let me make clear, you will not get a confirmation on the text, but your vote will count if you vote before the debate and after the debate. And then again, at the end of the debate, whoever moves the most votes will win. While we are letting you vote, let me introduce our wonderful slate of debaters, who I'm very glad that we have. Starting on my far right is Jens Ludwig. He's the Edwin and Betty Bergman Distinguished Professor, Service Professor at the University of Chicago, the Pritzker Director of the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, the Co-Director of the Education Lab, and the Co-Director of the National Bureau of Education Research Working Group on the Economics of Crime. His current work focuses on how behavioral science and data science can help solve social problems. Jens, your work spans 2 fields, so where is it harder to make reform, crime or education?
Great question. In the city of Chicago, the murder rate is 5 times the national average, and the dropout rate is twice the national average, so you can see how good I am at my job. People yell at me less for the work that I do in education than crime, so either I'm a much worse crime researcher than education researcher, or maybe education's a little easier.
All right, we'll take it. Nakia Towns is currently the Chief Program Officer at Accelerate. Previously, she served as the Deputy Superintendent in Gwinnett County Public Schools in Georgia and in Hamilton County Public Schools in Chattanooga, Tennessee. She was also Assistant Commissioner at the Tennessee Department of Education. Nakia, I have a which is tougher question for you as well. Improving schools from inside district leadership or from the outside?
So you frame the question as, is it easier or tougher to improve schools from inside the district or from outside? So I'll say this, you are more likely to improve schools from inside the district, but it's certainly easier from outside the district.
Fair enough. Eric or Rick Hanushek is the, arguing against the motion on my left here. Rick Hanushek is the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. Rick is an internationally recognized scholar for his economic analysis of education and other issues. His research has broadly influenced education policy in both developed and developing countries. Rick, you are the first person to ever be a repeat guest on the AEI debate stage, so welcome back. Thank you for your service, and I'll just ask you, who do you think has the easier lift tonight, your side or those arguing for the motion?
Well, the problem is judging it on the marginal change, because everybody comes in here on the other side of the motion to begin with, and so it's a question about whether the marginal change is large enough. I lost my first debate on exactly that issue, that the other side came in and had basically nobody in the audience agreed with the position, and it only took 3 people to get a huge change, and I lost that debate. So I'm waiting to see what happens.
You know it's an economist when the answer is, well, it's the marginal change. Yes. Chris Riskowski, or CR, served as the New Mexico Secretary of Education under Governor Susana Martinez. where the state achieved record high graduation rates, record low college remediation rates, while they increased standards for the diploma. He also served 6 years as Chief Talent Officer and Associate Secretary at the Delaware Department of Education, where he co-led the implementation of Race to the Top, which invested over $100 million in innovative education initiatives. CR, you led Race to the Top implementation in Delaware.
Yep.
Will that experience have anything to do with your arguments here tonight?
Yeah, it'll have a lot to do with my arguments. I mean, I think it positions Rick and I well here, because it's not that we don't think that any type of federal stimulus could be good. I think Race to the Top did a lot of good in Delaware, in Tennessee, when Commissioner Huffman was there, in Tennessee as well. And I think we did a lot of good with that money. But I think the federal government and the Department of Education had a different caliber of expectations, different guardrails that they had put in place. And I think right now those things are pretty absent, which is a big reason why Rick and I are sitting over here on the other side of the table.
Okay, well, Chris is ready to get into this, and so are we. So let me start out with opening statements. Again, we're going to start with those arguing for the motion, and opening the debate tonight is Nakia Towns.
Thank you, Nat. Look, the backdrop is that we all just lived through what was the shared national trauma of the COVID-19 pandemic. And 4 years later, it almost feels like a fever dream. In 2021, I was the deputy and interim superintendent in Hamilton County Schools in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So I have on the ground real-time perspective on why $190 billion wasn't nearly enough to address the learning loss and school disruption that our students experience. To be clear, I don't think the challenge rests on local schools. I think we had a failure, and perhaps with good reason. There was a national pandemic. We had a failure at the federal policy level. So what were the gaps? To begin with, only 80% of the money wasn't earmarked for remediation at all. Only 20% was required to be spent on learning loss. And frankly, we needed the entire $190 billion for just the public health and safety system that we had to build for 50 million students. In my district, we were working on PPE, extra sanitation contracts, contact tracing, nursing staffs, call centers for the nursing staff. When you consider that we spend $4 trillion on healthcare in the country, that's what we were doing. We were building healthcare systems for 50 million students. But even if 100% of the money was allocated to learning recovery, there were two other problems: accountability and scale. First, there was no accountability to do the right types of remediation strategies and to make sure that we were going to get our return on investment. We didn't have any requirements to monitor the impact of the investments that we were making. And of course, we needed to get the money out the door quickly, so I appreciated that as a district leader who opened schools in the summer of 2020 in Tennessee and opened schools on time in August of 2020 in Tennessee. But there were scant rules or regulations to produce learning outcomes. Two, the $190 billion was woefully insufficient for the scale of the problem. It was never going to be enough money. My colleague at Accelerate, Matthew Steinberg, and a colleague of his, Dr. Shores, in 2022 found that we needed $700 billion to be able to redress the learning loss. So consider that we spend about $700 to $800 billion on education annually, and on average, students missed about 52 weeks of in-person instruction. When we think about the 20% allocated for learning loss, that was only $38 billion. So when you consider $38 billion versus $700 billion, that was 5% of what was needed. And basic econ here, there is no free lunch. There is no such thing as a free lunch. $190 billion wasn't nearly enough. It was less than a $5 down payment on a $100 lunch bill.
All right, Nakia Towns, thank you very much. And opening for those opposing the motion, Rick Henyushek.
There's no doubt that the COVID pandemic was a huge hit. There is a cohort of students, half of whom are now graduated from K-12 education with a bad future, and half of them that are still to be educated, and they've been hurt dramatically. I think we're back in general to where we were in March of 2020 with our schools, but this generation on average is going to lose 5 or 6% of their lifetime earnings because of the COVID loss. And yet What Nikita says is that nobody told them that that the schools had to deal with this. They only said you only had to deal with it 20%, and nobody held them responsible for it, so they didn't do it. And that's exactly the point, that you throw money onto the system, and out the other side, you don't get much. We've quadrupled spending per pupil in real terms, adjusted for inflation, since 1960 or 65, and NAEP scores over that period are flat. So what are we supposed to take from that? That if we just add on more money, we're going to get something different than we got with the last spending? I don't see the argument other than people point to very specific things, like if we hire this firm to come in to do this training, they'll do a good job. Of course, no school district actually hires that firm to come in to do that training. So just pointing to the fact that there's a possibility of doing something well doesn't mean that it happens.
All right, Rick, thank you. And next, arguing again in support of the motion, Jens Ludwig.
Great, thanks so much. What I wanted to do with my 3 minutes is maybe highlight underscore 2 points of agreement, and then highlight, I think building on what Rick said, highlight, I think, the one key point of disagreement on which the debate basically hinges. So one point of agreement that I think we can all start with is that human capital is something that the government should be in the business of promoting, right? So I'm not the government more government spending is intrinsically good person. I'm an economist at the University of Chicago. I understand all of the skepticism that people have about government and what it spends and how much it should spend. Economists have a framework for thinking about what the government should appropriately do rather than leave to the market. And one criteria is situations where we have externalities or spillover effects. And it's very clear, I think, to everybody that we have that amply in education. And another justification for government involvement in education is market failure of a different sort. Kids are liquidity constrained. Low-income kids can't borrow against their future earnings. So I think we all agree, if there was something productive to do, this would be worth doing for the government, right? So we're taking ourselves out of the box about the government in general spends too much or too little. That's thing one. Thing two, I think, builds on what Rick just said, which is like, we're putting all this money in these public schools and they just can't do anything. It's paraphrasing. And I want to turn that slightly differently to a different question, which is like, do we have any examples of public school systems doing something at any scale that's really helpful? And I would argue from the experience that my research center has had in Chicago and now in different places around the country, that the answer is yes. Even these big city public school systems on their own can do amazing things. So we've been partnering with Saga Education and the Chicago Public Schools to study the effects of high dosage tutoring in some of the most economically disadvantaged communities on the south and west sides of Chicago. They're some of the most disadvantaged communities in the entire United States. We can see that the result is something like double or tripling what students learn per year, which is a life-changing trajectory change to student learning. So we can see that even a school system like this can do it. I think the crux of the debate here is going to be whether there is a way to get the amazing things that public schools can sometimes do, to do that at large scale reliably. I think that is basically what the argument is.
All right, Jens Ludwig. And finally, wrapping up, CR, Chris Ruskowski.
I think probably very few reasons for Nat to invite me here tonight. Certainly not fashion style, and certainly not that I live nearby, right? I live down in South Carolina. But I think maybe perhaps one reason is that for me, this issue is very non-ideological. I spent 10 years, similar to Nakia, I 10 years working for governors under both parties, right? I played for the blue team in Delaware for 6 years. I played for the red team in New Mexico for 4 years. At different times in that 10-year period, there was a Republican president or a Democrat president. At different times, there were 3 or 4 different U.S. Secretaries of Education. I worked for 3 or 4 state secretaries of education. And so for me, this is very much non-ideological. I think that's maybe the only reason, actually, Nat would have invited me here tonight. But I think perhaps one universal theme across all of those places is this insatiable appetite for more funding. And that does seem to be a place where, at different times, in different ways, groups of people that are very diverse ideologically, take the 89 superintendents in New Mexico, or the 19 superintendents in Delaware, or the 46 counties in South Carolina, can get together and say, we need more money. This is not specific to the current moment, nor is it specific to, I think, whether or not there are things that work, right? I'm personally a huge fan of the charter school program, right? Which is a federal stimulus to schools of choice that the current administration has tried to, cut or stop here and there. And I think that's a bad idea, and that's federal funding. And I was a huge proponent of Race to the Top, and I worked on that for 6 years from beginning to end, and that was a huge federal stimulus. But I think when we look at the way that the $190 billion was actually spent, whether you want to use some of the egregious examples like the new AstroTurf fields or the urban bird sanctuaries or the new logos and murals on walls, okay, fine. Those are kind of the throwaway, dumb examples. Or whether you want to look at the fact that at that point in time, the federal government said that only 20% of the $190 billion should be spent on learning. There's something fundamentally wrong, I think, in this last 5 to 10 years about the ways in which the federal government, whether you want to talk about Congress or the department under both administrations, engages with these huge federal stimuli in ways where there is not the accountability or the policy or the guardrails. And that's why at this point in time, I don't think this is a good idea.
All right. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the opening statements. Now it's my turn to ask questions. And I'm going to start out with the side arguing for the motion. The title of the motion, right there in the title, $190 billion wasn't enough. And I think that's a good place to start. Nakia, you talked about, well, that wasn't enough money. Chris talked about, well, maybe it wasn't spent well. And I think that's an important point. So a two-part question. Was ESSER spent well? And I mean the $190 billion that was distributed. And does it matter for this question?
Direct it to me specifically. Yes.
Either of you may take it.
Do you want to go?
No, you start.
Oh, okay, all right. So I think there are two different questions on the table, which is, was the money spent optimally? I agree with Nakia, the answer is no. I think we're all in agreement the answer is no.
Yep.
Right, so I think that's another point of agreement. I think the disagreement is forward-looking. Would there be a way for the money to be spent better? That'll be what we talk about. That's thing one. The answer is no, it was not spent well. The second question is this is repeating what Nakia said. The second question is, was it enough money? Would it have been enough money even if it had been spent well? And there's one way to look at this, I think, which is like $190 billion is a ton of money. $190 billion is more than the federal government ever gives out in education. But there's a different way to look at this as well, which is the $190 billion was spread out over multiple years, right? So it's not like a one-time infusion. And you should think about what the base level of spending on K-12 education is in the United States. Nakia mentioned we spend something, call it $800 billion a year. So if you take $190 billion and you divide it over the different years that it was spent over, like that turns out to be something like a 6% increase in K-12 spending, okay? Now, if you ask yourself, like nobody alive in America today, nobody alive in the world today had been through anything like this before. 1919 is when we had the Spanish flu, right? This is the 100-year flood, and that 100-year public health flood that created a 100-year public education flood. And so then you ask yourself, in any other area of the world, would you imagine a 6% change in spending being enough to overcome the 100-year flood in that area? You would say no, even if you had spent the money wisely.
So, opponents, what do you make of that? Was it too little money?
Yeah, I can't even think about $60 billion. It's just not relevant, that's such a trivial amount of money. And what an argument that the whole argument is that there's no sense from any evidence we have that providing more of the same kind of funding would do better. The second argument that Jens slipped in at the end of his opening statement was, well, the way we're going to fix our schools is we'll outsource it to some private firm. We'll do exactly what we were doing on the regular schools, and then we'll outsource the difficult jobs to the private firms to do the tutoring, as if nothing could ever change in the public schools. I'm stunned by the whole argument.
I do think that there's this point, and I think Jens has named this a couple times, there's this point of consensus amongst the four of us that maybe if you locked the four of us and 20 other folks in a room, we could come up with some sort of additional, again, I don't know exactly how to scale the amount of money, right? Because to Rick's point, 190 billion sounds like a lot to me, right? And 60 years sounds like a lot to me, but I understand the point you're making. We did a lot in Delaware on 100 million during Race to the Top. That seemed like a truckload at the time. I think Delaware got maybe 2 or 3 times that, right, via ESSER. So I do think there's some consensus around, could we try to come up with a $30 billion package that had $5 billion for high quality urban charters and $5 billion for tutoring and $5 billion for teacher performance pay, like some of the things that I think we all have spent our lives working on. Yeah, I think you probably could. I mean, I think the four of us could, but I just don't think that's how it will play out, right? And so I think, I wish that's how it would have played out basically since ESSA. So what is that now? 8 years? 2016? Since the Every Student Succeeds Act? When, all control went back to the states, and then the states gave it all to the districts, and the districts gave it all to the schools. Like, that was the end of the guardrails 8 years ago. That was the end of the structures for accountability and metrics and data. And so in that context, even though we probably could find agreement, I just don't see it playing out that way, right? And I think as a result, it doesn't feel like a good use of taxpayers' money.
Nakia, I want to ask you, as far as a call for the federal government could spend more money, what is it that you would want them to do? I mean, do some problem definition for us. The schools right now can't do X, and federal funding could help them do X to improve student outcomes.
So I'm going to step back before we get to the X in the equation. I think there's a lot of context that's missed in the generalizations that are being made. So before we even got to the pandemic, we all have to remember that before that, another 100-year event, the Great Recession, schools were suffering, enduring austerity cuts. And so just as we thought we were beginning to dig out of that and the reduction in resources that we needed for children, the pandemic hits in 2020. In the meantime, between time, the argument about what can quote unquote government do, the federal government is not just the presidential administration, right? Congress had the opportunity and still does have the opportunity as who controls the purse strings to put conditions around the dollars. And I'm glad you brought up ESSA because the states are in the driver's seat and states can make change. As you alluded to, CJ, Tennessee, from 2009 to 2015, Sean Reardon at Stanford produced a report over what were the average learning gains across the country, and he mapped the report. And everybody looked at the little green rectangle in the center where there were a large majority of the districts who had outpaced the country in terms of average learning gains. And that green rectangle in the center was Tennessee. And that's because Tennessee had also won the race to the top in the first round and had a series of reforms around school, district, and teacher accountability that led to outsized learning gains. States can do this. If Congress writes the passage of the law and says that we condition these dollars around states building strong accountability frameworks, there is evidence, history. We can go back to the books and actually look at that and reproduce what we were doing as we were marching up to the pandemic, again, digging out of a Great Recession where people were constrained. And so if you were to give those dollars and condition those dollars around return on investment, which is a lot of the work that we're trying to do at Accelerate, it's not just about evidence. Is the evidence strong enough, rigorous, causal impact evidence? That's what we're focused on, RCT. And then can you measure the return on investment? Meaning, what is the dollar for dollar return to student learning, making that investment and comparing that against and contrasting that against other interventions? This is possible. It's doable. We can regulate it. We don't have to depend on a federal administration that's presidential. We can do this with the cooperation of Congress and the states.
Rick, let me ask you about this. Does the history of federal investments in education, what do you make from that? What do you draw on that evidence to inform, is this likely to work? Are Nikia's claims, are they probable, plausible?
No, I mean, the entire argument is it's possible to do something better. And there's no doubt about that. There's no doubt that some districts have, in fact, done better and spent more money wisely. There's nothing that says that they can't. It's whether you can do this at any scale. So the federal government got into funding education in 1965, the Elementary and Secondary School Act of 1965 that introduced Title I, basically compensatory funding. That's been half of federal funding goes to providing more funds for disadvantaged kids. And yet the achievement gaps between high and low SES kids over this period have not changed since 1965. And the federal government has put half of its money in there. We're talking about, let's put in another 190 billion. When I was in Congress, congressmen always got confused about millions and billions and now trillions. We'll put this, just add this on, not thinking about the fact that we're already spending a lot of money in Title I for schools and not getting very much uniformly out of that. So it's always possible to argue that they can do this. We just don't have any systems where the states feel that they should do it, and that they have building their own incentive system. We have seen since ESSA came into effect that what states have done is back off any accountability for teachers for performance of students. It's systematic across the country that there's much less after we went to ESSA of accountability for teachers. That's the choices that are being made. So whether smart people can insist that they do something that we'd rather they do or not is the question, and I haven't seen it.
I mean,
Jens?
can I respond? Like, I'm imagining a version of this conversation after the pandemic hits in the White House when Trump was president.
Yep.
Thinking about how to address the once 100-year flood on the public health side. Right, and there's a bunch of, like, global pandemic, everybody is desperate for a vaccine. And if you can mentally simulate what that time was, right, all the conversation was, how quickly can we develop a vaccine? Not quickly, because the FDA is totally broken, right? It's like the FDA and the drug review process, the drug development and review and approval process is super torqued towards risk aversion and whatever. And people are like, we're just going to have to live with this horrible thing for years. And then, much to the credit of the Trump administration, they, like, despite this very bad backward-looking history, they said, this is the 100-year flood. We're under it. They were also under an enormous amount of public pressure to do something about this. And they did it. They did something that I think all of my, like, medical researcher, health economist friends are stunned that the federal government did Operation Warp Speed. And I think part of me thinks if we could do Operation Warp Speed in a way that there was no backward-looking history to suggest we could do, why can't we do an Operation Warp Speed in education? And partly one hypothesis is with the public health crisis, we had horrible visuals that galvanized public urgency for the government to do something. We do not have terrible visuals for the 100-year flood in public education. And so we don't have the same sort of hair on fire from the public. I think if we had that,
you're
I think we
taking
would
our
all be
side.
more optimistic.
I guess-
You're taking our side, right? Thank you.
This is where we have some, so I
You're
guess,
taking our side.
I guess, yeah, right. I guess my question for us, for you to wrestle with as our colleagues across the stage here is, what went wrong the first time and why would we think it would be different this time, right? That is to say, I don't know if the political context is that much different. I don't know if the federal superstructure, if you will, is that much different. I don't know if the appetite at the superintendent level, at the local school board level, is that much different. I think Nakia's pulling on my heartstrings over here because she and I are about to go out and get geared up for Race to the Top 2.0. And we'd probably move to the next state that won together and work on it. So, I mean, like, it's working. But I think, but I don't see a world where that is what's going to emerge. Instead, what would emerge is some sort of, $8 billion, $29 billion, $54 billion package that would sit inside of the Every Student Succeeds Act context, where maybe a couple of powerful coalitions, right? The Charter Coalition, the Tutoring Coalition, would get a little slice of that pie. And the rest would go from Congress to US Ed, to the SEAs, to the districts, to the schools, and we'd have a 2.0 repeat of what just happened. And I think one of the saddest parts about the past couple of years is the ways in which that structuring it in such an unstructured way has led to people losing faith in the role of funding to make change for kids.
Well,
right? So it's a
2.0
challenge.
2.0 is, what ESSA did was make it illegal to have another Race to the Top.
There you go.
I mean, that's in the law. And so the idea that we're going to do something that appeared to be productive again, when in fact the Congress has an appetite to make sure that it doesn't happen, is hard to accept.
Jens, how do you respond to that? How might we lay this out so that this could be productive?
Yeah, I think, let me just respond for starters to part of what my friends on the other side of the stage are saying, is I think it's important to keep in mind when looking backward at the first tranches of federal assistance, that it was happening in the middle of the 100-year flood. Right. And so, like, again, it's very, very hard for us not to engage in hindsight bias and Monday morning quarterbacking, where in hindsight, if I were in the federal administration in June of 2020, I would have done this or that. Very easy to say from, a May 2024 perspective. But again, this was literally the world turned upside down. We were washing the groceries that were delivered to our whatever. I was wearing a mask on the Chicago lakefront for fear that, whatever. Nobody knew what was going on. So I think we shouldn't over-index on the craziness that happened the last time. I think the electoral politics the politics are genuinely, it comes down to what is your sense for the public and the politicians' demand for doing a better job the next time. I mean, I'd love to hear why Nakia has been on the inside and sort of seen this play out. I'd be very eager to hear what you would say to that.
So I'm going to put a fine point on what Jens just said in terms of over-indexing on, the 190 billion was a mess. It wasn't a mess. I was there. We needed to get the money to open schools. We had to have just the basics of what people required of us to keep children and the adults who supported the children alive. period. So getting the money out the door quickly it wasn't an option for a federal policymaking level, I don't think, to slow the process down to say, let's come up with an innovative race to the top, like even if the politics were there.
Right.
The politics were on get the money into the schools. People were already overwrought, after the spring around what virtual instruction looked like or didn't look like. And in certain places, if you understood the desperation of the equity gaps in terms of what was happening with some children who were not in school and having no visibility around that, like it was a crisis, right? So to think that we were going to build an accountability framework in the middle of a national crisis where literally all the optics, as you said, people were dying, and we had folks most vulnerable, if you will, asset in their families, their children coming into our schools, we had to stop and take care of the first things first. So even if the money had been completely allocated and had been 100% dedicated and had return on investment around just learning outcomes, that would have been insane to suggest in the moment. The second point that you're making in terms of what is the policy position now? How can we build the national coalition and the urgency around the student learning outcomes now? I think we're getting there, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, Rick, you mentioned the NAEP results. Well, they're getting worse. We know where we are right now in terms of what people are seeing. We talked about this, Jens and I, back in December, but the viral TikTok where all the middle school teachers are trying to convey to us that these middle school children do not have middle school skills, and they've never seen anything like it. And so I think we're coming up upon what is going to be the economic hole that we're going to cliff. People talk about the fiscal cliff of Esser. What's the economic development cliff when all of these children are supposed to be moving into workforce and they don't have the skills that are needed in order to have the productivity that we expect as a country? We're getting there. We need to be there. We need to highlight that, and that's what's going to move people to have Operation Warp Speed for education. It can happen. Congress states.
And I'm gonna follow up that with the opposition, but I want to make the audience know that let you know that I'm going to come to you for questions in about 2 minutes. So get yours ready. But let me ask you a derivation of what Nakia was asking. Aside from the $190 billion that was already out, aside from that, what's the counterfactual? I think those who are saying, well, we need more spending because we could improve student outcomes. What's the counterfactual that we're looking at if we don't do this?
So you're asking just the right question here now. The money, in my opinion, is not about what we did in the pandemic. There's no sense of urgency that I see because as soon as somebody leaves K-12 education who's been through the pandemic, they're going to take a lifetime hit. Their learning is low, and we have no way to recover from it. And we've already lost 20 million kids, and we're just marching through that with no sense of urgency. The real question here is, what would we do with another $190 million if we were on dry land in February of 2020? And we look back from dry land of February of 2020, and we have been putting systematically, except for the one thing that Nakia mentioned of the 2008 downturn, was the only time in 100 years that real spending per pupil fell for a year, and then that was a year. We've been systematically following this idea that, well, if we just go out and hire Sega, we can solve this problem, and we'll add that on to the system, and we've been adding this and that on, and to a point where we have gotten nothing out of it. So why isn't that the counterfactual of what happened, what was going on in January of 2020, not what was going on in May of 2020?
CR, briefly?
Yeah, really quickly. On this counterfactual point, it's a great question. I do think that since I think similar, Nakia and I also share this in common, that I like some of the bright spots that are happening in states, right? I do think we are seeing state legislatures, right now. I mean, New Mexico's done another $100 million for early childhood in the last 5 years. South Carolina in the last 5 days put, 20-30 million aside for math labs and instructional materials. And I mean, Texas has done a ton of good work right, through House Bill 3 and 1882. So I do think that maybe the counterfactual is states stepping up, using their revenues in ways that we are seeing that already happen. And so I do think that this is really a question about whether an additional federal stimulus is needed. It's not whether or not more money might be needed to do some good things for kids. And I think states closer to kids, with their revenues that they're, I mean, a lot of states have a lot of revenue right now, are investing it, maybe in the exact same way we'd want to invest the federal dollars anyways.
Okay, so I want to turn to the audience. I promised I'd give you some questions, and now is your chance. We have 2 rules at AEI about asking questions from the audience. The first is to identify, just tell us your name. And the second is that we ask you to ask a question. So we have someone in the back, and I'm looking for hands through right over here.
Hi, thanks for doing this tonight, everybody. I'm very dubious about more money because I think it'll go into the whole no strings attached, because that's what the teacher unions, they will demand no less. They demanded no less when in-person learning requirements were proposed in the fall of 20, and they were killed by the teacher union. So I see history repeating itself. But why should more money be spent when the teacher unions will pocket this money and they were the reason for the prolonged closures? So we're going to reward them with more money to correct a problem that they exacerbated to an enormous degree, it seems to me. There's just something wrong with rewarding with more money the people who were responsible, the union leadership responsible for these prolonged closures that did such academic and psychological damage to children. We shouldn't reward that, seems to me.
So that's a question, I think, for the supporters of the motion. Response?
So I see this differently. I reframe. I don't think about it as rewarding the teachers union. I think about addressing deficits for children, for students, right? We've already talked about, Rick is saying we're just gonna, march through the 20 million. I reject that. I reject that as we're just gonna let it go down the line and that we're never going to attempt to catch those students up. We do have a moral obligation to this generation of students who had their learning disrupted through no fault of their own. In terms of the policy framework and the dollars, there were plenty of places and states, districts, I was in one of them, where schools opened. Mm-hmm. They did open in July in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We did return to school on time with a virtual option for families that weren't comfortable, but our school doors were open. And so I go back to the legislative priorities and that Congress has the ability, and we do have a Congress that's evenly divided, and if we had bipartisan agreement that we want to make sure that the learning outcomes are there, we could include in the legislation the requirement around what states need to do to build a framework. And the point that CJ was making about the innovation that we already see happening in states, that's actually a positive for the argument that we're making. Because if you're a state who wants to try to make these investments, by the way, like I think post-pandemic, hasn't it been about 27 states have science of reading legislation now? And you're trying to figure out how do we support folks being able to buy all the new curricula, the new assessments, the training for teachers to be able to make that live. And then you have an opportunity from the federal level to be able to use those investments, provided that you build the accountability framework that says, A, it's going to be evidence-based, rigorous evidence, RCT level, causal impact, and that you're going to measure return on investment. Why would we think that a state who's already trying to do this on shoestring wouldn't come in line? Why can't we believe that Congress can move that argument, and that's something for the president to sign off on? The administration doesn't have to create it, and we've already seen that state legislators are out here leading on it.
Brief response?
We have examples of things that work. DC Schools, I think, is one that has an evaluation pay system that's been effective. I think Dallas, Texas has been another. We have 13,500 school districts in the US, and I named 2 of them. And we could probably together name another 3. And it just is not something that's inherent in the system that success is replicated, But in fact, we have a few examples of things that work, but it's not replicated.
There is something I think that is a little bit different. Maybe this is very wonky and technical about money that passes through 6 levels versus money that passes through 3 levels.
We have another question right out here in the front, Sean. Thank you.
Hi. I love this look at the bright spots, at the things that we can do, but also looking at education and how it is one of the most polarized topics. Can we get politically or in the balance of forces to the point where those 2, 3, 5 successful examples can be adopted nationwide? Do we have the political will? What would it take? Or what would the balance of forces look like? How would systems have to change for that to be possible?
Let me ask the supporters of this. I mean, the question is, well, what will we have to do to get the stars to align to make this work? And if it's a long stretch, it seems like, that's sort of tough for supporting the notion. So Jens, I mean, how hard is that? Is that a good objection to support for this?
That's just too hard to push this out nationwide. Yeah, I mean, I think connecting the last 2 questions, I reflect a little bit on my experiences in Chicago, which is not a weak union town. I don't think I need to say. And, there, what we saw, is there inefficiency in the Chicago public schools? For sure, right? But, and would I love to wring the efficiency out of the Chicago public schools? For sure. We're not going to do that anytime in the near future, unfortunately. And we have, as Rick has pointed out, we have a cohort of kids who are progressing through the school system where we know that there are key developmental milestones. If you can't read at the end of the third grade, your dropout risk goes up by a factor of 4. If you haven't passed Algebra 1 by the end of 9th grade, dropout risk goes up by a factor of 5. Right. And we can't wait to do massive sort of efficiency improvements. The question is, can we do something surgical? And I'm taking a lot of signal from the fact that even in a big, complicated, messy, inefficient public school system like the Chicago Public Schools, this is not just bringing in a world-class vendor like Saga Education to do tutoring. CPS built their own in-house tutoring system that winds up generating results that don't look all that different from what a world-class vendor like Saga Education gets. And so I can see this happen in Chicago, and that makes me think, if you can do it, it's sort of like the Frank Sinatra song. If you can do it in the Chicago public schools, maybe you really can figure out a way to do this in lots of other places too. And we're working with a bunch of districts around the country that, Rick says maybe we can find 3 more. We have 8 more for you, Rick.
This sounds
that's a
just like
300% increase over.
This is exactly like everybody likes their own congressman. It's just every other congressman. I like my Chicago schools, but it's every other 13,000 schools. Come on.
I just think it's such a good question and something that I feel like for those of us that have now worked at the classroom level, the school level, the district level, and the state level, like many people in this room and many people up on stage, it's such a tough question. I think one of the things, whether it's because of the political constituency that can form around things like early childhood education, tutoring, high dosage tutoring, instructional materials, after school programs, right? These are sort of what I call the issues that poll at 80%. Does that make sense? And so sure, on those issues, we've got really good consensus, we've got some galvanizing power, and those are important things, and those things can matter for kids. I think what Rick and I might say is that those are often the appetizer, the dessert, and the second vegetable, and not always the meat and potatoes of the school turnaround work, the principal development and principal human capital work, the teacher quality work, right? And so I think that's the challenge, is it's not that we can't get consensus and that we might not be able to figure out a way to spend more money in a way that everyone would vote for. versus the things that we know we need to do that everyone wouldn't vote for.
So I'm going to have one more question, and then we're going to move to closing. So it's right over here. Sean, thank you.
Thank you. Jason Botel, thanks for this conversation.
Hey, Jason.
I know we're at the end, so real quick. Look, there's a lot of money, ESSER money, not obligated yet. There's a lot of obligated ESSER money that's going to have to be de-obligated and re-obligated because things are going to fall through. And to Secretary Muskowski's point, there's a lot of state money that's starting to be injected in similar ways. How would you recommend right now districts that have the choice and states that are structuring things, how should they be spending the money that is available to be spent now?
I got this phone call yesterday from a colleague in another state that said, we're sitting on about $20 million. What should we do with it? I think that's the question, right? Yeah, I mean, it's weird because it's like by September. And you get that, all the encumbering, the liquidating. Look, there's all sorts of really interesting one-time investments. I'm a talent guy, so I'd probably do all sorts of things in long-term pipeline development, right? The teacher pipeline and the leader pipeline. That's for me, one idea.
I have an immediate answer. Nobody listens to it, but the research says, what really counts in schools is high quality teachers. And that's not anything that's been on the table here. But if you wanted to deal with the learning loss for this unfortunate cohort that's been hit by the pandemic, provide incentives to your more effective teachers to have slightly more kids in their class. Provide incentives or give those slightly less effective teachers smaller classes. And you immediately change the balance, the average quality of the teaching force, and you could do that overnight. But nobody is willing to actually do anything that changes the system. We're looking for things that we can add on top of the existing system, keep everything we've got there, and hope that works.
Anything from the supporters of the motion?
I would say this in terms of things to do now. I think that the points that have been made are well made. I think that we have the learning strategies that we've talked about, high dosage tutoring that do have a high return on investment that you can, allocate for the short term and extend the obligation, the extended liquidation period, if you're going to do those through external contracts. And I think a lot of this conversation has been, and maybe rightfully so in the national moment that we're in, Debbie Downer on what schools have been able to accomplish, right? The standards reform movement, like for all the backlash to the language of Common Core, almost every state raised their standards, right? 27 states have adopted science of reading legislation. That's not one or two districts. That's happening at a high rate. High quality instructional materials. Since Ed reports the notation, who defined high quality, 40% of the market has moved in terms of using those materials. So I just think we're being, very clearly negative when we have some big examples over the last decade of not just moving at the margins, people moving on things that are substance. Instruction, curriculum, and assessment.
The idea of science of reading was an idea introduced by George W. Bush in 2002. And so all of a sudden we have a push for it, which I think is good. I think it makes sense. But think about this. That's nothing new. That was not a new business.
All right, so schedule is insisting that we move to closing statements, and we're going to go through them in the exact order that we started, and that starts with Nakia Towns.
So I think where we started the conversation was about what we can do moving forward, the $190 billion, but what do we need to do moving forward? And so I say that states can help lead on the accountability for the necessary future investments. I've given you the example of Tennessee. I was there for that work. That work has endured. And we saw the results based on the Reardon study out of Stanford. When you have a whole state where most of the districts on average are growing faster than the national average, that means that you can actually move the results with state policy. So we can hold schools accountable. And if you're an accountability champion, as I've noted, you don't have to rely on a presidential administration to do that. The president doesn't control the purse strings, Congress does. Congress can condition the additional dollars on strong accountability frameworks at the state level. And then Congress and states can work together to ensure the additional investment drives a return for student learning. If you're skeptical about the current administration, then look to Congress and the states. Then finally, I have to go back to the moral argument. We can't forget that we have a generation of students that we cannot leave behind. These students endured disrupted learning through no fault of their own. As a nation, we have to understand what is going to be the long-term impact from an economic development, social development. When we say what is the counterfactual, I don't think we can imagine right now the counterfactual if we just throw our hands up and say that we're not going to try to do anything to close these learning gaps. And we'll all be looking at each other 15, 20 years from now, wondering what happened on a lot of different levels. So with that, I say that we're the adults in the room, and we have to understand when it's time to make the right kinds of investments. And it's up to us to make this right.
All right. Thank you, Nakia Towns. Rick Hanushek.
We've heard the word can so many times, and I've heard it for many years. It's always the justification for just putting more money in, but you put more money in and the districts don't actually do what was said was going to work. We look at the legislation, it's not the president, the current administration is not very interested in K-12 education as far as I can tell, but neither is Congress. Congress is the one that passed ESSA in 2015 that basically said we want to get out of this business. We don't want to have any activist things on the part of the federal government at least, but also on the part of state government. And so I don't think that we can just do things on the margin if we want to improve the schools. The argument on this court is simply that once kids have graduated from K-12 schools, the colleges and universities aren't going to do anything to remediate the learning loss, and the employers aren't going to do anything to remediate the learning loss, and the military isn't going to do anything to remediate the learning loss. So that as we lose 4 million kids a year through graduation, while we decide what we're going to do either to the long-term pipeline or so on, just recognize, I agree with Nakia completely. This is a moral issue, and we failed.
All right, thank you, Rick Hanushek. And wrapping up for the support of the motion, Jens Ludwig.
Okay, Nakia made a moral argument. I'm going to make an economic argument. And so I just want to take stock again of where we are. So we have agreement that there are promising interventions that Rick, sign me up for your idea of the better teachers getting a bigger class size. I think you would support the idea of high dosage tutoring if we could get districts to do it well. Comes back to this question of whether we can do that. So the economic argument that I want to make is to ask yourself, like, what are the odds that we think we could do an Operation Warp Speed for education? And as an economist, I ask myself, what would those odds need to be in order for me to like that bet? Because in economics, the key to our thinking is like, there's always risk-reward trade-offs out in the world, okay? So what is the reward here? If I look at the sort of the ROI on the tutoring work that we've done with public school districts around the country, we could argue about the benefit-cost ratio, but let's call it 8-to-1 is our estimate in the American Economic Review. So and it's so high because if you're religious, you're familiar with the term teach a man to fish, right? So we're adding human capital that then makes people more productive over their lifetime, keeps them out of the criminal justice system, so on, okay? So with an 8-to-1 return, you have a machine that if it works, you put $1 in, you get $8 out on the other side. How much risk would you be willing to accept in order to get an 8-to-1 return? Surely you are willing to accept some risk, right? You wouldn't look at this and say, I need to be certain. And so then you need to make a judgment call about how much risk you're willing to tolerate. I feel like the vibe from the other side of the stage, if I can sort of say that, is like they look at an Operation Warp Speed for education and feel like can't win, don't try. That leads to increased income inequality and reduced economic growth. And I think I look at the 8-to-1 returns and the risk here and think, let's try with an enormous sense of urgency.
How much, though? How much risk?
And-
You were going to answer that question.
We'll have to get to that in the drinks afterwards, because now we have 2 minutes closing.
Again, I mean, I
from
think,
Chris Ruskowski.
I think it's such a hard question that we wrestled here tonight because, I grew up in Minnesota. I worked for Senator Paul Wellstone, who was, the liberal lion of the Senate. And I certainly grew up when I was in college, believing that one of the major reasons why our education system wasn't serving all kids well was because it was underfunded. And I believed that probably from the age of 6 until the age of, I don't know, probably 29. And then I spent 10 years in state government. And I saw that it wasn't underfunded, that we did not have an appropriation problem. We, generally speaking, had an allocation problem. And so here we are tonight talking about a massive federal appropriation, right? And so it's not that the states have not, I bet you if you studied all 50, however many 54 legislators and governments right now, you would see that tens of billions of dollars had been appropriated at the state level for proven and promising practices in the last 24 months. Tens of billions. And I bet you those state legislatures and those state governments will keep an eye on those dollars and have fairly decent ROI and have some risk built in. But a federal stimulus coming off of $190 billion that had limited ROI in 2 straight administrations, one blue and one red, not just one administration, in 2 straight administrations, where ESSA was the law of the land, so therefore local control reigns, so therefore the money gets passed through and passed through and passed through and passed through 6 gates without a strong department to really hold people accountable and have those guardrails. I just think it's a really tough sell in the current climate.
All right, thank you, Chris Ruskowski. Thank you to our debaters, and the debate is now closed.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you, Matt.
And now it is time, if you'll look at the screen, to make your choice again. The final vote on the motion, $190 billion, was not enough. The federal government should spend billions more on pandemic learning loss. Again, the number is 571-622-3318. What do you say on the motion? Text 1 to vote yes, the federal government should spend billions more. Text 2 to vote no, the federal government should not spend billions more. And if you still are undecided, you can talk to us after the debate, but please text 3 to 571-622-3318. We have folks in the audience voting and at home, so I'm going to give them a couple of minutes, or on the live stream, as it were. Okay. And I'm going to have a quick whip around. In the president's budget that came out this spring, there was, to my surprise, $8 billion in marginal investment for the Department of Education. What do you make of that? Let's start with CR.
Yes, I actually read the proviso today because I was thinking, well, I bet you they're already doing something. And so $8 billion, I think they call them academic achievement and acceleration grants. Sounds like we're no longer in an 80-20 world because, if you will, to Nikia's point, the sort of the healthcare element of the crisis is mostly over, right? So now we're saying $8 billion and 100% should be spent on academic and acceleration. I think the interesting thing will be to keep an eye on is whether or not that's doled out to everyone, or if it's block granted, where states have to compete for it. I'd certainly love it to be in the latter camp.
Rick, what do you make of $8 billion in the budget?
2 weeks ago, we tried, I'm not sure it'll be successful, to give away another $19 billion in student loans. and put that in the context of $8 billion for the kids that have been really hurt versus with a potential long stream versus this political giveaway of the loan forgiveness policy. I just think it's an attempt at political gamesmanship, and it's not real.
So I'm going to make sure that my guys are tabulating the votes. Your votes should be in. But Nakia, what do you make of the $8 billion in the budget?
Yeah, I think the $8 billion is a start, right? I mean, again, I go back to where we think what investment would we really need to be able to address the learning loss and disruption that was experienced, and we're not nearly enough. When I think about other programs that happened, what was it, during the pandemic, I think $800 billion was spent on the PPP program. So at some point, we have to start prioritizing where we want to put dollars and what do we think has the long-term return. Jens made the point, if you would put $1 into a machine and know that you would get $8 out, what risk would you take on? What level of investment would you make?
Jens, interpretation on that $8 billion entry?
As Nakia said, it's a good start. Head Start gets something like $10 or $12 billion, but at the risk of a year, so $8 billion more for remediation is good. I think at the risk of sort of agreeing too much, like Rick, when I see tens or hundreds of billions of dollars going to writing off student loan debt for people who were lucky enough to go to college, and then the massive underinvestment for things that would actually help. Little part of me dies on the inside, and so I hope next time the president's ready to sign a big check for student loan, I hope somebody grabs him at the last second and gets him to do something more developmentally productive for kids instead.
All right, well, I'm going to
well
ask
said, well said.
my RA Joe to bring me up the results, and I just can't resist because I have been tracking student loan forgiveness that I wholeheartedly agree. But Jens, thank you for that. And here we are with the, let's see, round one. For those voting yes on the motion, our round one was 38% supported the motion, 24% were against the motion, and undecided was 38%. In round two, the undecided was 0%. We had 59% were for the motion, so that's an increase of 24 points. And those arguing against or voting against the motion was 41% for an increase of 14 points. Yeah. So the motion is yes, wins the night.
All right.
That is the results of our debate. I want to thank our debaters. This was very civil and constructive, and I want to thank our audience for spending some time with us this evening, and I want to wish you a good night.
Thanks, Sharon.